Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Anthony Mead, and I'm the director of the Morlan Gallery here at Transylvania University. A couple of housekeeping things that I just wanted to mention from the top is that we do have the closed captioning function available. If you are interested in using the closed captioning here on Zoom, you can enable that by just taking your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, and it'll pull up a little menu there, and you'll see the CC icon where you'll be able to turn on that closed captioning. Also, I just wanted to go over the format for tonight's conversation. We will, of course, begin with hearing Beauvais talk about his work, and then following that, we'll have a brief question and answer session. If you are interested in asking a question, then you will also just scroll down to the bottom there, and you'll see a Q&A box. It's basically a chat function. And in that way, you'll be able to type out your questions, and we'll address those later on this evening. You can go ahead and type in those questions at any point throughout the conversation, and we'll just get to them after Beauvais finishes his presentation. So we are really excited and honored to have Beauvais Lyons joining us tonight to talk about mock documentation and his artwork. You can see Beauvais' work in the online gallery for Morlan at transy.edu/Morlan. And there you can see the Factitious exhibition with Beauvais' work and all of the other wonderful artwork from all of the artists there. Beauvais Lyons is a Chancellor's Professor from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he has been teaching printmaking since 1985. Lyons received his Master's in Fine Arts degree from Arizona State University in 1983 and his Bachelor's in Fine Arts degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1980. In addition to that, Lyons is the director of the Hoax Archive, where he creates and curates mock academic projects and exhibitions. For the past 4 decades, his works of lithography, sculpture, and even taxidermy have played on the visual languages of archaeology, folk art, medicine, zoology, the circus, and always have included some form of biography. These one-person exhibitions of Lyons have been presented at over 80 museums and galleries in the United States and abroad, and his prints are in numerous public collections, including the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art in Philadelphia. In 2002, he received a Fulbright Fellowship to teach at the Fine Arts Academy in Poznan, Poland. In 2014, he received the Santo Foundation Arts Award, and in 2017, he received the Southeastern College Art Association Conference Excellence in Teaching Award. Everyone, please join me in virtually welcoming Beauvais Lyons.
Thanks, everyone. Before I start the presentation, I do want to thank Anthony as well as his colleague Kurt, who contacted me about this lovely exhibit. And I'm sorry that we can't be present together to walk through the gallery and hear this presentation, but in due time we will be able to. It is interesting to consider ways in which the factitious can survive even in the virtual. Maybe as we may think about this evening, they often lend themselves to that kind of format. So I'm going to initiate screen share here and jump into the presentation. The title of my talk, as Anthony mentioned, is Mock Documentation. And when I started to create imaginary civilizations, dating back to, in fact, when I was an undergraduate student, I would characterize myself as a mock archaeologist. But over the decades of doing this kind of work, I sometimes think of myself as a mock academic. An auspicious title for someone who now holds the title of Chancellor's Professor at my university. Let's see, for some reason I'm not, okay, here. So really the concept of the mock documentary, the mocking part of it is something we might think of as a form of parody. And her 1985 book, A Theory of Parody, Linda Hutchin defines parody as ironic imitation of a specific work, a genre, or a discipline to comment on a canonical aesthetic, theory, or object text. And I think it's these three different modalities of parody: the imitation, ironically, of a specific work, a genre, or a discipline. So if you Google Mona Lisa parody, you'll get a screenshot like this. And in fact, most art parody tends to be targeted at specific works of art. And so here we even have Osama bin Lisa, the father of our country, with Mona Lisa smile, you know, lots of busty pinup Mona Lisas and so forth. And so there are ways in which this is a really fun way of commenting on and kind of playing with these famous works of art. Sometimes these forms can be political, as in Mary Beth Edelson's 1972 collage, Some Living American Women Artists, in which she presents Georgia O'Keeffe in the Christ as the Christ figure, centrally located in the one-point perspective of the Last Supper, and then proceeds to introduce a broader cast of important artists, women artists who have influenced American art up to 1972. But more often than not, works of mock documentation really don't comment on specific works of art, but I think their power and their import comes from actually ironically imitating not just a genre, but a whole discipline. So we can look to a variety of parallel modes of cultural expression in literature. For example, Jorge Luis Borges in the 1940s wrote a novella titled Tulun Ukbar Orbis Tertius. Tulun was a planet, Ukbar was a province of that planet, and Orbis Tertius, Orbis circle, Tertius at the third level, or secret society. And in the story, the central character finds one volume of a 40-volume encyclopedia that described every aspect of Tulun. In Tulun, the fundamental science was psychology compared to physics, so that in Tulun, reality was a series of perceptions in time rather than a series of objects in space. And the encyclopedia describes every aspect of Tulun, from its architecture to its poetry, from the dread of its mythologies to its languages, and so forth. And this idea of presenting a whole world, a fictitious world, but in the factual form of the encyclopedia really appealed to me. And in fact, it was my father, an English professor, when I was interested in the idea of inventing cultures, who gave me a copy of Borges's book Labyrinths, in which this particular novella was presented. But there's other modes of the mock documentary. In film, you have numerous examples. One of my favorites is Woody Allen's movie Zelig, but in which Allen plays this chameleon-like character named Zelig, who is inserted into various historic times and periods. You see some of the same devices used in a movie like Forrest Gump, or movies by Christopher Guest, like A Mighty Wind on folk music and so forth. Of course, you can trace some of Christopher Guest's movies back to his role in Rob Reiner's film, This Is Spinal Tap, which was a mock rockumentary about a band that couldn't distinguish between sexist and sexy, that thought that if they had an amplifier that went to 11, it'd be louder than one that went to 10, and so forth. So it tended to lovingly but critically treat the genre, in this case, of the mock rockumentary. So our world has many aspects of it that align with the factitious exhibit. So when Superstorm Sandy hit the East Coast, people were sending through social media this screen grab from a scene from the movie The Day After Tomorrow from 2004, in which the rising seas are overtaking the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. So oftentimes the fictitious becomes promoted through various news and information systems as if it was real. Using a few Photoshop techniques, you could make it look like there was a shark in your backyard in Brooklyn as Superstorm Sandy encroached on your property. In fact, we can see this today with QAnon, you know, an entirely fictitious conspiracy theory, which some people regard as real. So it's often interesting to consider the ways in which these works of the factitious can be potentially dangerous, as well as modes of critically examining culture and information. We can look to someone like Stephen Colbert, who was the mock political conservative for his show, The Colbert Report, in which he advocated for the concept of truthiness. And so the truth is not really the truth as we think of it in scientific or epistemological terms. It is this thing that we believe to be true. And if you believe it strongly enough, it will become true. So this is where the fact and fiction can kind of merge. There was a whole exhibit titled Art in the Age of Truthiness, curated by Elizabeth Armstrong, that started at Site Santa Fe and went to the Minneapolis Institute for the Arts in 2013, that investigated this question of the real and the more real and the hyper real and so forth. A central thesis in that was a reprint of Carrie Lambert Beatty's essay in October, the Critical Theory magazine, where she advocates for this concept of parafiction. So we have the paralegal, who's not quite a lawyer, the paramedic, who's not quite a doctor. They're kind of in this liminal role in relationship to being a lawyer or a doctor. And in the essay, she writes about the plausibility, about concepts of plausibility. The art of the plausible discloses consensus about the way things are, but it also can make a new reality sensible, accessible both to feeling and reason. So there's an aspect of the imagination and what we hope or believe could be possible. I think unidentified flying objects often sort of fit in that kind of role. So there's ways in which this space of the credible or the incredible are ones in which artists often interrogate. So take political activists like the Yes Men, who insert themselves into corporate culture and create stories that fix the world, as they say. If you're interested in this form of kind of mock documentary as a way of changing reality for political purposes, certainly the Yes Men would be of interest to you. This, for example, in the lower right is a special ball for corporate executives developed by Halliburton that would protect them from global climate change. This is the story of a fictitious communications officer for Dow Chemical who reported that they were going to liquidate Union Carbide and sell the company and give the proceeds to the people of Bhopal, India, who were injured by the Union Carbide insecticide disaster that had happened 20 years previously. And so they use the conventions of corporate media in order to undermine the corporate power structure, or at least hold a mirror up to it. There's an artist named Joey Skaggs who has a whole website devoted to the art of the prank. And in this one, he's posing as Father Joseph of Carmel, California, who has a portable confessional booth that he took to the Democratic Convention in 1992, I think, and took confessions from people outside of Madison Square Garden. And the whole thing was designed essentially to have the media cover it like he was real. And so this intersection of the fiction and its media representation. But he's done all sorts of projects that have been designed to essentially deceive the media. He even created a brothel for dogs called the Cat House for Dogs. All of it staged for media consumption, all of it fictitious. But when people experience it through media representations, they may presume it to be real. So thinking about pranking as something that intersects with these, we can look to ideas like Lewis Hyde's The Trickster Makes the World, and the ways in which the artist can be like Coyote, or a raven who's like a shaman who's a ventriloquist, and this notion of mischief, myth, and the role of art in sort of creating these imaginary worlds or these deceptions that become real. You know, it was Picasso who said, art is a lie that tells the truth. So there's a rich history of this kind of work, and a lot of this in terms of the ways in which we perceive and understand the world come through journalism. So in 1917, the writer H.L. Menken wrote an essay in the New York Evening Mail titled A Neglected Anniversary. And he remarked that the 75th anniversary of the introduction of the bathtub to the United States had come and gone, and no one had a parade for bathtubs. No one had an official proclamation in honor of bathtubs. And in the essay, he then proceeds to tell the story of the introduction of bathtubs to the United States, in which he writes, late in 1843, the Philadelphia Common Council considered an ordinance prohibiting bathing between November 1st and March 15th, and it failed of passage by but 2 votes. During the same year, the legislature of Virginia laid a tax of $30 a year on all bathtubs that might be set up, and in Hartford, Providence, Charleston, and Wilmington, special and very heavy water rates were levied upon those who had them. Boston, very early in 1845, made bathing unlawful except upon medical advice, but the ordinance was never enforced, and in 1862 it was repealed. People assumed that Menken was writing a real history of the bathtub. He made it all up using the conventions of journalism, and part of his intention was to say that, you know, newspapers have ginned up stories about combat that have led the country to war, like the Spanish-American War with Remember the Maine and so forth. So part of his critique here is of a gullible public who may believe anything. So in the mock documentary dimensions of this, there are publications like the Journal of Irreproducible Results. And this goes back to the 1950s, has an editorial board that includes some of the most prominent scientists and academics and scholars. And it used to be published quarterly. It's now published under the name The Annals of Irreproducible Research through MIT in Boston. So they would have articles on topics such as the genetics of mermaids, feline reactions to bearded men. There was a companion article about canine reactions to bearded men. and a proposal to preserve the Grand Canyon by filling it with different kinds of styrofoam chips. So of course, a lot of this is done in pure play, but it also becomes a critique of scientific methodology. There's a conference of medieval scholars that's typically held every May, where the final session is their parody session, where there's mock academic medieval papers on a variety of subjects. And it's one of the most competitive sessions at that conference to gain admission to. So there's other examples of this, including Horace Miner's Body Ritual Among the Nasrima, an article published in the American Anthropologist in 1956, and also David Macaulay's Motel of the Mysteries. Miner wrote the Body Ritual Among the Nasrima for the American Anthropologist. He was a respected anthropologist at the University of Michigan, and he wrote about an imaginary culture in which the opulence of a house is measured in terms of the number of ritual centers that are designed to help prune and maintain the visual appearance and smell of the human body. So Nasrima is, of course, American spelled backwards, and what he's describing are our fascinations with having water closets in our homes, or rather bathrooms, in order to engage in various forms of personal grooming. So he used the language of the anthropologist or ethnographer to discuss American society. Likewise, in Macaulay's Motel of the Mysteries, he excavates a motel from the 1980s in which the archaeologists misinterpret the various things they find so that the toilet seat is a kind of ritual headdress and so forth. So there have been a number of artists who've invented worlds, particularly in ceramics. You have, and I won't show all of them, but there's Clayton Bailey's Wonders of the World Museum. Clayton Bailey just died a few months ago. He was a longtime faculty member in the Bay Area at Cal State Hayward. Here he is with his Bigfoot Museum and a sign for Wonders of the World Museum. And he would make bones of Bigfoot, and he would sometimes set these up outside along the beach and things like that. He would be there with a pith helmet. And so he had different displays that showed scientific analysis of Bigfoot droppings. He had one display that showed the comparative anatomy of the penile bone of Bigfoot with that of the normal human male. And it turns out that Bigfoot's penile bone is triple jointed and that it's capable of making a U-turn. And he speculates maybe this is the reason Bigfoot is so rare. He has fossil testers, a cyclops skull, and so forth. So Clayton Bailey later also made incredible robots, but this sort of playful investigation of paleontology and archaeology and so forth. In the 1970s, an Italian architect and graphic designer created the Codex Serafinas. And I was able to acquire this about 10 years ago. I saw it first in the 70s when I was an undergraduate student, and it was too expensive for my budget. But it's lovely because it's sort of like Borges' encyclopedia. It's 300 plus pages of these incredibly detailed drawings that create this world with a text you can't even read. But as you look at it, you realize that this is chemistry, this is zoology, this is optics, ethnography, and a special branch of linguistics that looks like some kind of drool drawing. What's so great about this book is there's 300 pages of it. And I think that's a big part of it. Like if you want to create convincing mock documentation, it's just like 1 or 2 pages is not enough. You have to be all in. We have a kind of phrenology on the left and ichthyology on the right. So this idea of the encyclopedia, owing to Borges and so forth, Sue Johnson, a Maryland-based artist, created the alternate encyclopedia. This is a catalog from that exhibit. When you enter the show, there's sort of a strange combination of a taxidermy pheasant, a weird chair, and a painting of a bird lady with various fruits and so forth. And so it is this kind of Kunstkammer or Wunderkammer. She took old biology diagrams and reworked them in weird ways, like, why is the woodpecker in this image at all? Or why are the other ones there? What is the chipmunk saying into the inner ear or the brain stem? I mean, look, imagine, like, remember when you were in high school in 10th grade in the biology class, right? And you'd look over at some diagram like that. It might have looked like this to you, you know? She also created a whole series of non-silver photographic prints with book pages. She has the anatomy of a Pegasus and so forth. So when I was in graduate school at Arizona State, Rudy Turk, the director of the museum there, learned about my work and told me about this guy, Norman Daly. He was a professor of painting at Cornell University, who in 1972 created the civilization of Luros. I'd never heard of it before, and I put together a letter to Norman with one of my prints, and it was like 3 or 4 pages long. And it took 1.5 years before he wrote back to me, but he ended up sending me a postcard from Amsterdam because there was a show in Amsterdam that was a tribute to a civilization of Luros, where other artists created their own imaginary cultures. And he wrote back that he thought this whole thing was crazy and that he'd like to learn more about my work. But I got to spend 10 days with him after I first started teaching at the University of Tennessee on a research grant. And we co-authored an article in Leonardo, the journal of the International Society of Art Sciences and Technology, about Luros. And the project included over 150 works of art, from a small pillbox size scientific instrument to a large facsimile of a temple wall. So here you can see some of the displays. On the right is a hermaphroditic tralib that appears in the left page here in the lower right, described as being from the middle period. It's a facsimile of home fertility votive, and so forth. So here on the upper right is a nasal flute that apparently was played by a Peruvian Olympic medalist. So he creates all of these stories, and in the form of the catalog. He had translations of Laurentian poems. One of my favorite is the Pilkug love song, which goes, "If you want me as I want you, you would let me die under a petal of your rose, and you would bury me in the lobe of your ear." So Norman was pretty amazing, and all this work was documented in this form. And part of what he was interested in was creating work that looked like archaeology, but it would have all sorts of things that would disrupt its authenticity. So it often played with the fictitious and the factual. So Daly was not alone. In fact, in the late 70s and 80s, a number of people started doing some of this work. And I think a lot of them did this kind of mock documentation completely independent of one another, not knowing that someone else did it. I think it came out of a sensibility of critiquing authority, questioning authority, the kind of critique of institutions and systems of knowledge and information. So two California printmakers, Eleanor Rapp and Eleanor Bender, created Carulia Ruins and Restorations, which they exhibited at the De Young Museum in the same showcases where the Treasury of Tutankhamun show had been presented in the late 1970s. So here's a photograph of part of the installation of Carulia. There's a Carulian board game. No one exactly knows the rules to it. They presented the evidence to two archaeologists, one at San Francisco State and one at Cal State Berkeley, who published a preliminary report on excavations at Carulia. Of course, these are real scientists just sort of playing along. They knew it was a work of fiction and so forth. Another project that was created in the mid-1980s was by Bill Willers. He was a zoologist at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, and he took a human study skeleton and a Shetland pony and made a centaur burial. And then he showed it a number of places, and then in the early 1990s, almost a decade after he made it, he wrote to me wanting to know if I knew of some place that would buy it. We raised funds at the University of Tennessee and we bought it for our university. And here it is in the back of a University of Tennessee cargo van after I picked it up. And here it is after we designed and built a special case for it. And it's been on permanent display in our library on the first floor, right near references and government documents. And it asks every freshman who comes to the University of Tennessee, do you believe in centaurs? And the prompt here is to get people to think about what's real and what's imaginary and why we presume something to be real or imaginary. Just because something's in the nonfiction section of that library doesn't mean it's true, for example. And a novel, which could be a work of fiction, may have a great deal of truth about it in terms of what the human experience is, the human heart is, and so forth. So it has a text panel on the back. I worked with colleagues from a variety of disciplines, and we adapted his project to presentation in our library. It's been written about by Adrienne Mayer, a Stanford paleontologist, in her book, The First Fossil Hunters, in which she makes the argument that, in fact, the ancients, when they found a mastodon skull, thought it was a skull of a cyclops, and you can clearly see why. So there's this interesting intersection of the mythological creature and the real paleontological record. We had a seminar on hoaxing in science and teaching in order to encourage, this is back in 1993, bring a variety of people together to talk about what we believe in science and why we believe it. And so this is a view of it in its former location. It's now on the other side of that same floor. But you can see it's as if the library was built around the centaur. So this notion of the museum that presents the imaginary as if it was real is certainly reflected in the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles. It was the subject of Lawrence Weschler's book, Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonder. And when you go to that museum, you need to really spend a full day studying the microscopy hall, where there are sculptures that sit on the head of a pin, or a display on bats that can fly through physical objects, and so forth. I cannot do the Museum of Jurassic Technology justice. So you can go there to the website, mjt.org. It's quite lovely. And they have a super gift shop as well, which any reputable museum should have. There's also my friend, the Canadian artist, Richard Purdy, and I'll show you a couple of his projects. This is Corpus Christi. And so what we see here are drawings from the Vatican Library showing a city that was designed to bring together the concept of the civic body and the body of Jesus Christ. So in the left hand was the academy, in the right hand was the theater where all the arts were practiced. He made a model of it. Right here is the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart. And the clergy was in the halo, the government was in the head. There were parks and airy areas here. The people are the blood of the city. So every day they go to the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart along the veins and arteries that are the avenues and roads. There was the navel where there was a fountain here. In the area corresponding with the genitals is where the brothels were thought to be located. However, excuse me, that part of the plan had been obscured by a Vatican librarian. The bankers were in the knees and the prisons were in the toes. Unfortunately, Corpus Christi was never built because it was considered to be militarily indefensible. He also created a project called Inversion of the World. This was done shortly before the turn of the millennium. And it was an atlas of the world where when the year 2000 struck, everywhere above sea level will become below sea level, and everywhere below sea level will become above sea level. So islands would become lakes, lakes would become islands, continents would become bodies of water. So there's the Afric Ocean or the great islands in the North American Ocean and the South American Ocean. So that at the turn of the millennia, people got in flotation devices to prepare for this inevitable inversion of the world. Lenore Mallon created the New Harmony Society in upstate New York that used special medicinal techniques to align the electrical fields in the body and to produce a state of harmony and health. So she's a photographer, she teaches at Parsons, and she had diagrams of various medical procedures, this history of tying a copper rope around your midsection to trees in order to align the electrical fields with your body, and so forth. So she's essentially revealing this kind of medical science of sorts with profiles on various patient case studies and such. Kathy Rick, for her MFA thesis at the University of New Mexico, later shown at SEPA in Buffalo, presented the Daughters of St. Catherine. It describes an obscure convent in Hungary where the pious nuns starve themselves for the greater glory of God. So it's about this, about her own struggle with anorexia and the ways in which this Catholic sect of nuns would essentially achieve states of spiritual awareness by not eating. And so there's long traditions of this asceticism in not only Christianity, but Buddhism and other religions. And so she gave this material form, so to speak. Another artist, Katerina Buren, who now teaches drawing at Harvard University, created a project on Petra, andrejova, Molnar. And this is a catalog from the project. Molnar was a mid-20th century architect in a very male-dominated profession. She had connections in her design pedigree to the Bauhaus, and this is her most famous building, Hotel Nord-Sud, that was constructed in the late 1920s, early 1930s in Yugoslavia along the Adriatic Sea. And so she designed desks, she designed the building itself, so there's plan drawings. So Buren is essentially inventing a female architect of the early 20th century, very much in sort of the mode of Mies van der Rohe. So she has models of the building and so forth. This kind of paper architecture, photographs and so forth, documenting it. And then I invited her to the University of Tennessee, where we worked. She'd never done a lithograph before, and we printed 5 different sheets of stationery from Hotel Nord Sud. And then also over here on the left are 2 matchbooks. And so we even attached sandpaper, black sandpaper for strikers to the prints themselves. An amazing project is by F. Scott Hess, his paternal suit heirlooms from the F. Scott Hess Family Foundation. And this is a project that is amazingly only took him 10 years to produce. He's mostly known for his figurative paintings. He's a Los Angeles-based artist. But what he did is he created an art collection, art and other objects from his family's history. And so it's beautifully documented in a hardback book. And so he has historical paintings that are from the family collection that depict important members of his lineage. It includes a general for the Confederate Army, Alfred Iverson, and this was a model of a bas-relief that was to be added to Stone Mountain, Georgia, that was never constructed. He got interested in the project in part because of Ancestry.com and family lineage, and much to his horror, he learned that a number of his ancestors were Southern plantation owners and white supremacists. So this project was a way of sort of constructing that story, but also creating a kind of fictional narrative around it. So this leads me, with a little bit of time left, to introduce my own work. I'm going to show 4 projects. I've not included my folk art project and some earlier projects, but I'll nonetheless take you through several different ways in which I've pursued the mock documentary. So all of this has been done through the Hoax Archives, which of course sounds like the word H-O-A-X. And this provides a kind of conceptual umbrella for me to produce the different projects. As Emerson said, all history is biography. And so here I have a portrait bust of Everett Ormsby Hoax, founder of the Hoax Archives, with some of the projects, like this is an Azudian hieroglyph, this is a print with Hoax Medical Arts, and here we have a ceramic statue of a griffin for Creative Zoology. And presumably here is Hoax drawing on a lithographic stone for the Medical Arts series. So with the reconstruction of a Azudian temple, like my early mock archaeological works, when you enter the show, if you're going to see an exhibit about excavations, you need a large-scale photograph of the excavations. There's a 25-foot-long facsimile of the temple wall. There are frescoes showing scenes of gods and goddesses and daily life. This is the goddess Ninmulam, the goddess of garlic. This is Lakut, the goddess of bread. And this is Eklam and Tulam, the ideal married couple. So with these things, I make the artifacts, I paint them, I break them, I leave out missing sections, I sandblast them, I stain them, and then mount them for museum display. I also make prints in the style of 19th century lithographs that document. So it's this fabrication and documentation. This is a print that shows Azudian divination beads, or various architectural structures. And then there's a whole series of ceramics I made. There's over 300 different Azudian hieroglyphs. People say, how can you break these? But you know, they often look much better when they're broken, actually, and then glued back together again. This is an Azudian milk jug. This is a print of an Azudian pipe. This is a vessel with an inverted spout. No one knows exactly what they were used for, but some scholars suggest that they were carried by mourners in funeral processions in order to collect their tears, which were poured together in a ceremonial vessel. Then I have the members of the Zoological Society of America. So these are monoprints with lithographic printing. This is Charlotte Dallaire. She used hypnosis to reconstruct the missing sections of Azudian hieroglyphs. So we have all of these different missing sections carefully filled in. She got to be really good at it. That painting on the wall back there was done, I did based on a model of the temple that I built, but then I just had not enough place to store it. So I ended up disposing of it, but at least I got to do a rendering of it for this show. A second project is Hoax Medical Arts. I've always been interested in that history of the print that doesn't find its way into the art museum, that finds its way into the medical museum or the history museum, or the history of printing currency or numismatics or stock bills or advertising and so forth. So with Hoax Medical Arts, I describe how Everett Ormsby Hoax was working with various academic institutions and hospitals to publish prints about weird and unusual human organs. Sometimes they were arranged like this to make a skull-like face, or they were published in different languages. This one in German that I printed in Berlin at a print shop there, or early forms of eye surgery, or strange kind of things that combine the brain and the belly. This is what I would describe as Dr. Gray's Anatomy meets Dr. Seuss. Of course, a lot of the plates number into the hundreds, as if this is, you know, up into the 300s, and this is the atlas of human body parts. So I made I helped bring the centaur to the University of Tennessee in the early 1990s. And then in 2006, there was a story, especially when the Creation Museum had been constructed right there in Lexington. And there was a lot of discussion about intelligent design and the theory of evolution. And at the time, a majority of Republicans doubted the theory of evolution. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I need to make art for these people. So looking back to the Centaur, when we had these panel sessions during the first 4 years after the Centaur was installed, I gave a talk where I took wood engravings of animals and I made these sort of crude hybrid creatures and claimed that centaurs are hybrid animals and God creates all sorts of hybrid animals like this dog bird. I even made a print at the time of the Zoostorilla based on a collage that combined a zebra, a rooster, and a gorilla. And but I put all that work aside and didn't think much of it. And then in 2006, 2007, there was this story. So because of this, I created the Association for Creative Zoology. And the idea is that Hoax collaborated with the Reverend James Randolph Denton of the First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who was concerned about the rise of secular humanism in America and thought that an educational campaign should be put together to help educate Americans about creationism. For example, the King James edition of the Bible references unicorns in Job and Psalms and various other books in the Bible. Revelations includes references to dragons, and there's other references to hybrid creatures, including human-animal combinations in the King James edition. And of course, if we look at the classical world, as Adrian Mayer writes about, we have sphinxes and all sorts of other hybrid creatures. I went to Dayton, Tennessee, just down the road here from Knoxville toward Chattanooga. And this is the Ray County Courthouse where the John Scopes trial took place in 1925 after Tennessee passed the Butler Act, which prohibited the teaching of evolution in public universities and schools in the state of Tennessee. And down here is a kiosk that I built in which I displayed my prints of creative zoology. And so they have a theatrical reenactment of the original trial with Williams Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. And this is when I had 2 kiosks and presented it at the Museum of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. This is just half a block away from Liberty Bell in the Thomas Jefferson Garden. This was for the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. So I dressed as a preacher at these various showings and would hand out scripture about creative zoology. And of course, we do this for the children, right? And kids love mythical creatures. So I've kind of realized part of my target audience for the factitious is in fact young people. This is a print that proposed a statue in honor of the Reverend James Randolph Denton. Unfortunately, it was never approved for Central Park in New York. However, you know, there's a lot of controversy around statues these days. I think a simian's winged centaur would be a great statue for most cities these days. So one of the main collections of prints for this project was called Rare Zoological Specimens, and even included a duck-billed platypus along with a horse dog. Or this is Microterus trichopolaris, the bass fish, rather the bass cat, rather, or the giraffe snake. And these are what are called Trichopiscidae, or hairy fish. And is clearly evident, the one in the lower right is not kosher to eat. In fact, when I was showing these in Philadelphia, I would encounter chefs who were on their way to work at downtown restaurants who would come up and take an interest. And we'd talk about different ways of cooking these creatures if you were to eat them. People would ask about taxidermy. And so I worked with a local taxidermist here near Knoxville to create the groundhog fish caught by Lester Morgan in the Holston River upstream from the Tennessee River. Then did a print showing the groundhog fish, as well as the dogfish of Lake Lanier, Georgia. It's got a bulldog fish, of course. I made some fake taxidermy on the left here, like this gorilla hen, but you can see the difference. This is a real raccoon crow, and this is a fake gorilla hen. And I also have a flying squirrel here as well. So I was in a residency in Casterly, Belgium, and I made prints in Flemish that depict the monkey steer, the fox eagle, and this here is another one I did that shows the duck rabbit. And so it's a foldable print that shows a rabbit and a duck, but when put together, creates the duck rabbit. Oops, let's see. Of course, there's the set of prints that are part of the show, the virtual show at Transylvania University in the Morlan Gallery, and that's the ornithological quadrupeds. And so it's collected and compiled by Reverend James Randolph Denton, lithographed in 4 colors by Everett Ormsby Hoax, a publication of the Association for creative zoology. And of course, the classical four-legged bird is the griffin. There's 7 creatures depicted in this series, plus the title page and text panel with the Burmese lion hawk, the long-tailed marmot heron, and the American badger swallow. 2 of the American badger swallows happened to be shot by Lewis and Clark in the early 19th century along the Missouri River. So one of the creatures documented by the association is the Taurus crocatensis, which has an important connection to Tennessee and actually as well middle parts of Kentucky. So before the Great Global Flood, these majestic creatures wandered through the hills of Tennessee and Kentucky. Taurus for bull, crocatensis for Davy Crockett, who wore a coonskin cap. And it turns out that the raccoon is the official mammal of the state of Tennessee as well. And people would say, well, do you have fossil evidence for the bull raccoon? I sure do. And this was excavated south of Nashville. And I've proposed that the bull raccoon should be the official antediluvian animal of the state of Tennessee. Tennessee doesn't have an antediluvian animal. No state has an antediluvian animal. This would make Tennessee the first state to have an antediluvian animal. So here we have a print I made showing the bull raccoon wandering the Middle Tennessee region. And in fact, a number of schools could rename from their current mascots, the Rebels, and become the bull raccoon. So this is what your mascot might look like if you have the bull raccoons for your mascot. And your fans could wear coonskin caps with bull horns coming through them. It looks especially good on bearded men, so I made an edition of coonskin caps with bull horns. And this leads us to my current and ongoing project, Circus Orbis. So if I take archaeology, zoology, folk art, and the sort of sideshow of medicine, put them all together, I can make a circus. So 5 years ago, I started to create Circus Orbis, the story of Thaddeus Evergood of Jacksboro, Tennessee, who was a state gymnastics floor exercise champion and went to Rome, where he was a street performer and was inspired by the history of Rome to create this ancient themed circus. And so here's a pennant for the circus. And so here we have the bearded lady. This is very much influenced by Baroque art in Rome. Augustina, the bearded lady. Or centaurs find their way into my circus. The Centaur Brothers, Pride of the Aegean. Or taxidermy like the giant jackalope. So there's even a little flea circus in my circus. 5 shows daily. They're almost human. And I've just last year made a lithographically printed paper puppet theater. So the circus would send this to different cities in advance of their performances to serve as a kind of pre-show advertising. And this is what some of the work looks like assembled together from a show a little over a year ago at American University in Washington, D.C. So I'll conclude by quoting Ben Shahn in his book, The Shape of Content, which comes from his Norton lectures at Harvard University, in which he writes, as an intellectual center, the university can provide background and stimulation to the artist. It can broaden him as an individual. It can conceivably provide new direction for art. All this if one accepts the thesis that art is an intellectual as well as emotional process, and it thus profits by an expanded range of knowledge and experience. So as an artist who works within a university setting, the mock documentary also serves as a way for me to be the kind of prankster or trickster to the university itself, to engage in a kind of discourse with the disciplines that make up the university. So you're welcome to just Google the Hoax Archives, or you can find me through my website, volweb.utk.edu/B Lyons. So with that, I will stop and open up the floor for any questions.
Beauvais, thank you so much for that. That was really wonderful. So we do have a little bit of time for questions, and we have one already waiting for us queued up from Handi Ozken, who's a professor here, who asks, would you agree that such thinking on the factitious illustrates an arbitrariness of our categories, meaning the categories of thought which become naturalized in institutions? And if so, would such a critique of the arbitrary nature of categories reflect on contemporary politics, or what would the critique of them reflect on contemporary political movements such as speciesism, ableism, etc.?
Whoa, that's a big question. I'm glad the work has provoked that question, so thank you for it. In terms of the trans or interdisciplinary dimension of silos of knowledge, there are those who've used the hybrid animal to sort of embody this idea of the trans or multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. And you get into the semantics of what those mean, but nonetheless, I think there are intersections or conglomerations of disciplines that allow us to sort of test knowledge in different ways. So I think the answer is yes, in various ways, that the imaginary becomes a way of thinking. There's a kind of historic imagination, there's the ethical imagination. There are ways in which the creative mind can manifest itself, certainly in the sciences, but I think that at the same time, the silos of artistic investigation are tested and enriched by scientific knowledge. I think all of the, you're leading to a question of ethics that has to do with, as I understand your question, sort of understanding the world through the coded languages of disciplines and maybe the limits of those sometime. I'm not sure what's intended to think about. We tend to view the world through our own subjectivities, our unconscious biases. So ableism would be a good example. You know, we only see the need for curb cuts or closed caption when we can imagine ourselves to be wheelchair bound or blind or deaf, for example, right? So there's an aspect of the imaginary, the creative imagination that allow us to think beyond our present circumstances. So whether that is a limitation of different disciplines, I'm not sure, but when they come into one another and intersect, I think there's ways of rupturing and rethinking what we assume the world to be. It's a kind of epistemological question on how we base our understanding of the world. So I hope that answered what is really a profound question, and which I don't have a definitive answer for, but as an artist or anyone who is seeking knowledge through the language of their disciplines, they're often wanting to test it. And they use oftentimes empirical methods that test theories, and then you see where it takes you. So there's discovery in that process, I think. Hopefully, I have come close to answering what is a very profound question. So
It's a very large question. Our next question comes from Delara Miller, who is wondering, Do the differences in reactions from children compared to adults hold significance in your work and to you?
Well, Delara, thanks for coming to this talk. Yeah, I've wondered about that at times, because the work seems to appeal to people who have, academic fiction or mock academics sort of appeal to people who might tend to tune into the National Geographic Channel as opposed to an animated sitcom, although the animated sitcom can be an excellent form of parody. But what I've found really rewarding is just seeing how children respond to the work, and they oftentimes seem to get it right away. Whereas adults, I think where there's interesting challenges is fundamentalisms of thought, and they could be religious or they could be academic. So there are people who've come to the Scopes Trial Festival who thought that I was presenting real evidence that advanced theories of creationism. And then there are people from who are evolutionists who look at me and go, "You can't believe this, really?" But they think that maybe there was an association of creative zoology that explains why so many Americans might believe in creationism. One time I presented it at a college in Florida, and before the show opened, someone came in and they got really angry that the gallery was promoting creationism until they understood it to be a form of play. But I think children understand play. They're often sort of seeing the world through the make-believe. So if the work resonates with children, I think that's affirming. Hopefully it also resonates with adults as well. But we have different audiences for our art. And I think there is the third grader test is a really good one. If a third grader likes your work or is inspired by it, that's probably a pretty good sign.
That's fair. So Kurt Godey also has a question for you, which is that the Hoax Archive is a work and a story told most often by yourself or by others who are utilizing your words and stories retold. Have you ever had the opportunity to see or hear anyone who has had to come up with an explanation of the images that you create on their own? I'm thinking of perhaps an estate auction where an auctioneer has to quickly come up with a story in order to sell the prints. Are there any ideas or explanations that came from other people who have since become part of the hoax canon?
Well, I think more often, so when I was a younger artist, I would write to, as I mentioned, to Norman Daly and send back then slides and other communications with artists who were a generation before me. And now it's rewarding and fun to encounter younger artists who are interested in gaming and world making, and they have their own take on ideas of the mock documentary or the factitious too. I think the closest way to answer Kurt's question is with the centaur behind me here. It is often used for tours of our campus. And I received communications from a family from Florida that decided to vacation in East Tennessee because their child found the centaur on the web and wanted to see it in person. And so they got delayed in coming to campus. And so I was waiting at the centaur an extra 45 minutes, and 2 tours came by, and each of the tour guides had a different story to explain the centaur. And I thought that was interesting. And I think if I was to hang around my shows a bit more, I might hear some of these stories. But one person said that in the 1920s, the campus had a centaur problem, and that the fraternities sent out hunting parties to fell the centaurs. And another one said that centaurs are not real, but the human portions of this came from our world famous body farm forensics lab over on the other side of the river. Each of them had made up their own story about the centaur that was on display. And I thought that was good, that they were almost encouraged to do that as part of their narrative. When Eleanor Rapp and Eleanor Bender made Caerulea, it was shown one time, and they had an exchange with someone that was visiting the show who said that they had visited Caerulea from a cruise ship in the Caribbean, and that they got off the boat and they saw all that stuff there. And I thought, and they were like, no, this is imaginary. We made this. They said, no, that's impossible, because I saw this on that cruise. So I think the capacity of the human imagination to make something up and then sort of it to stick as something real or plausible is an interesting phenomenon.
So that leads me to another question that I was wondering about. You know, if we are going to be connecting with these plausibilities, and since you've obviously been thinking about, you know, the mock documentation for a long time, but now, you know, misinformation is playing such a huge role in our lives. Do you think that there's any rules that we need to kind of guide ourselves? You know, if people were looking to make documentation of their own or within your own work, is there rules that guide you so that you don't, you know, go too far astray, I guess, of a truth?
So, I mean, I came of age in the 70s, the question authority kind of world and generation. So, and I think certainly systems of information that we see today with things like QAnon or Russian social media bots and so forth. I mean, bias confirmation, you know, is something that's fed by fictions that people believe to be real. So I think a lot of it has to do with your intention. So my work is intended to require at least 2 readings. The first reading, you suspend your disbelief. And the second reading, you have this aha moment and you've seen through it. And I think that it only has value if people experience it both initially and then secondarily. So there was someone sitting at one of my shows when retired librarian from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, came to see the Azudian show, and she spent 45 minutes with it and she couldn't quite figure it out. And then someone gave her, I made this little fake academic article about Azudian ceramics. And he said, well, maybe this will help you understand it. And she read that, looked at it, still couldn't figure it out. But then she saw Hoax and she went, I get it. And then she didn't get mad. She spent another 45 minutes looking at it, and she could see all the places that she had been fooled and deceived. So hopefully it has some value because its intention is to playfully undermine systems of information while also helping to reveal the sort of rhetoric and those systems. I think that would be my answer. You know, I do think there are the ironic nods that I include in the projects. There are cases where with the folk art project, the Carnegie Mellon University issued a press release that said it was a real folk art collection, and an art writer wrote about it as if it was a real folk art collection. You know, there's not a lot of damage there. I mean, some people got a little miffed about it, but other times they feel like they need to give the game away, so they will have a disclaimer like, this is an imaginary 20th century science organization, and you know, I defer to the gallery. I sometimes send 2 different press releases. You know, the one that says it's a real folk art collection and the one that says it's a work of fiction about folk art collections, and let the gallery handle it the way they want to. But I will often give tours of the exhibits in the role of the director of the Hoax Archives, because it's also a performance space. But I think those questions are interesting, but it's important one's intentions. My intentions, the prank is, or the deception, or the parody is not really useful until you can sort of see its double codedness to realize there's a reveal at some point. And the problem with systems of information that are deceptive is they don't reveal. So essentially, they don't have that capacity to be art that suspend your disbelief, but then you sort of see how the trompe l'oeil is working, right?
Right. I want to be respectful of your time. We're, past our 8 o'clock. Delaria asked one more question that I was also wondering, which will maybe leave us on a note of just of understanding, I guess, for your process, which is, could you just tell us a little bit more about, how it is that you go about fabricating cultures and societies? You're constructing these whole worlds. And so where do you even begin as an artist creating, whole cultures and societies?
Well, it's not done a priori. So I don't make it and design it all in advance, because then making it would not be interesting. So it's a mixture of activities, from sketchbook drawing to looking at and studying. I mean, the part of it is emulation. Parody is both requires the aesthetics and craft of the thing that it's parodying to make its effect. So it's a kind of honor the father, slay the father kind of thing. It's, so you have to look at, I love Egyptian art, and so that informed the Azudians. I lived in the Middle East as a child. I went to archaeological and historic sites in Iran and so forth. I went to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in Iraq as a child. So those things inform what I do. I love pre-Columbian art. So I would sort of do a mashup of all those things to make the culture, and then typically start with the artifacts and then make the prints that followed them. And as I'm making them, I'm coming up with the stories. In the case of the circus, I'm making the prints first, and now I'm starting to make some of the artifacts. So every project sets its own thing. What I try to do as much as possible, I try to work in systems that allow me to create more than one thing, because then the evidence seems more convincing. And I enjoy that process of theme and variation in making the work. So every project's different, but now projects are taking longer and longer. And we're all mortal. So I need to decide how much evidence becomes convincing enough to present something. But this circus is going to keep me going for a little while.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a real pleasure, and added some laughs into a time when maybe laughs are needed. So,
right. And I hope people were laughing. I couldn't hear them, but I help us think, this is when the audience usually laughs.
I can tell you for sure that I was over here. So
okay. Thank you. I really appreciate being in the show. It's a really exciting exhibit with some impressive artists. So it's humbling to be part of this project, and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. And thank you all for attending this evening. And if you haven't yet, yes, please go and check out the Factitious exhibition at transy.edu/Morlan, and have a great night.